This broadcast is the property of Codependents Anonymous. Reproduction without written permission from Codependents Anonymous is not permitted.
Muted is muted, so we'll start this thing. Anything like this that I ever do, I like to start with a prayer. I like to start with a particular prayer. It's called the set-aside prayer, if you'll just indulge me. Higher power, help me today to set aside the things I think I know. Help me to set aside everything I think I know about you, everything I think I know about myself, everything I think I know about other people, and everything I think I know about this program. Also that I can have a new experience in you, a new experience in myself, a new experience in these, my fellows, and a new experience in my own recovery. Thank you, everybody. I am a grateful and enthusiastic member of Codependents Anonymous. My name is Ritchard, and I'm codependent as hell. And really glad to be here today. Just a really abbreviated bio. I've been in CoDA since the first Monday after Mother's Day, 2003. What happened for me was that I went through life feeling lonely, separate, different, and afraid. It drove some very codependent behaviors that ultimately got me to a nervous breakdown in 12-step meetings. Walked in my first meeting completely broken, and they made some simple suggestions to me to come to the meetings and get a sponsor and work the steps. And when I did those things, my life changed. It's going a lot better today. My home group is the Experience, Strength, and Hope group of Codependents Anonymous in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. If you're familiar with a little booklet called the 12-piece relationship toolkit, that group. And we're here today to talk about the promises. The content that I'm going to talk about today really grew out of some workshops at the Experience, Strength, and Hope group, and also at the Progress Not Perfection group in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And what happened for me is it sparked some ideas, and I've been developing those into the draft of a booklet that will eventually go through the same editing process that the 12-piece relationship toolkit did, and hopefully get submitted to conference for conference endorsement at some point. But my objective here today really is to introduce you to a new idea or some new ways of looking at the promises. In CoDA, we like to tell people that if your life is perfect, don't change a thing. You know, if you show up at your first CoDA meeting and you tell us that your relationships are great, you're in a fabulous marriage, your work couldn't be better, your kids are doing fabulously, we look at that and go, don't change a thing. But if you're having problems in one or more of those areas, then we suggest that you might want to do something different, because at the end of the day, that's what recovery is about, doing something different. If you want what you always got, do what you always did. But if you want something different, you're going to have to do something different. And so if today I am successful in introducing even one or two of you to one or two new ideas, I'm going to file today under the successful column. The 12 promises of Codependents Anonymous go like this. I can expect a miraculous change in my life by working the program of Codependents Anonymous. As I make an honest effort to work the 12 steps and follow the 12 traditions, 1, I know a new sense of belonging. The feelings of emptiness and loneliness will disappear. 2, I'm no longer controlled by my fears. I overcome my fears and act with courage, integrity, and dignity. 3, I know a new freedom. 4, I release myself from worry, guilt, and regret about my past and present. I'm aware enough not to repeat it. 5, I know a new love and acceptance of myself and others. I feel genuinely lovable, loving, and loved. 6, I learn to see myself as equal to others. My new and renewed relationships are all with equal partners. 7, I am capable of developing and maintaining healthy and loving relationships. The need to control and manipulate others will disappear as I learn to trust those who are trustworthy. 8, I learn that it is possible for me to mend, to become more loving, intimate, and supportive. I have the choice of communication with my family in a way which is safe for me and respectful of them. 9, I acknowledge that I am a unique and precious creation. 10, I no longer need to rely solely on others to provide my sense of worth. 11, I trust the guidance I receive from my higher power and come to believe in my own capabilities. And 12, I gradually experienced serenity, strength, and spiritual growth in my daily life. If you just bear with me for one moment, I am going to take those. Honest, I was going to. I am unable to paste those into the chat, which I was hoping to do to give you guys a reference, but we will be referring back. So think about the first time that you heard those. For many of us, it was in our first CoDA meeting. Others of us may have found the promises when we stumble across a CoDA website, or a friend may have shared them with us to let us know what they'd found in CoDA. Wherever we first heard these 12 remarkable statements, most of us had a visceral reaction to them. Some of us found hope. Maybe this is possible for me too. Others may have been skeptical. These promises are nonsense. I'm too damaged. This could never happen for me. Whatever our reactions, we came back to CoDA meetings and applied the program to our lives. We began to experience some or all of the CoDA promises. For some of us, they've come gradually, growing little by little over a period of time. Others of us experienced them suddenly. We awoke one day to the realization that we feel different, that we're experiencing freedom and exhibiting an integrity and dignity that we've never had before. Often it's only after we see these changes in other CoDA members that we notice them in ourselves, and we realize that we've changed in the very same ways. The one constant that we see is that CoDA members who actively work the 12 steps and apply themselves to practicing the 12 traditions do see the promises fulfilled in their lives. The purpose here today is to explore these 12 promises and talk about them, not just how we experience them, but how we can use them. Where I really want to start is with the 13th promise, which is, in my mind, in that introduction to the 12 promises, that phrase that goes, I can expect a miraculous change in my life by working the program of Codependence Anonymous, as I make an honest effort to work the 12 steps and follow the 12 traditions, ... That's a promise. And it's a truly powerful one. At least it was for me when I was new. I found that to be inspiring and even a little bit intimidating. So I'd just like you to think back to that first time that you heard these promises listed and what that meant to you. Let's get into the meat of the promises. So promise 1 says, I know a new sense of belonging. The feelings of emptiness and loneliness will disappear. Many CoDA members describe intense feelings, sometimes lifelong ones, of alienation. Some talk about feeling as if they were dropped off as babies by aliens. Others talk about feeling lonely, separate, different, and afraid. And still others describe the inability to feel loved or feel valued, even when they know intellectually that they are loved and valued. These feelings often provide a sense of emptiness and a profound loneliness that follows codependents throughout their lives. These feelings may be the prime motivators for many of our patterns of and characteristics of codependence. CoDA's Promise 1 suggests that we'll recover from these feelings and enjoy a new sense of belonging. Often, this is the first promise we experience, sometimes in our very first meeting. The warm welcome and unconditional acceptance we experienced as newcomers can sometimes penetrate our misery and our denial to suggest to us that we've finally found some place to belong. For some, the sense of belonging becomes even more concrete when we get involved in CoDA service. Whether at the group, intergroup, voting entity, or conference level, service work provides us the opportunity to connect with other recovering codependents in a new and vital way. And for many, this sense of belonging is also enhanced by sponsorship. We experience the love and acceptance that our sponsors provided us. Then we consider the love we feel for a sponsee who has placed their trust in us and the satisfaction we see from that sponsee's growth. In the midst of these considerations, it's easy to feel that we're a part of a greater whole, a chain of recovery in which we are a single link, or a river in which we are a part of the flow. We realize that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. When I look at Promise 1, one of the things that strikes me there is the feelings of emptiness and loneliness will disappear. Notice the phrasing there. They're not saying any feelings of emptiness and loneliness that we might experience will disappear. They're saying the feelings. They're assuming that if you're showing up at a meeting of Codependence Anonymous, you know about that sense of emptiness and loneliness, that it's part of this illness. And they're promising us that with a new sense of belonging, it will go away. I personally, I've come to the conclusion that feeling of lonely, separate, different, and afraid is the foundation of what we think of as a spiritual illness. That it affects not just us as codependents, but all of our brothers and sisters in all of those other 12-step fellowships. I've learned here that an alcoholic is somebody who is able to medicate that feeling, that illness, by taking a drink. They take a drink, and for just a little while, that lonely, separate, different, and afraid goes away. The overeater in OA can numb that feeling out with food. The addict in Narcotics Anonymous can get loaded and forget about that feeling for a little while. And for me, my drug of choice was 5 minutes of someone else's approval. I'm addicted to relationships and workaholism. And again, the fear that underpins that is what drives me to those addictions. And what CoDA has done for me is it's disarmed that feeling. I will still go through bouts of feeling lonely, separate, different, and afraid, but not all the time anymore. It's not the constant driver in my life. And that's been my experience with these promises. I'm here to tell you that in 17 years, every single one of these promises has come true for me as a result of doing what they suggested to me, coming to the meetings, get a sponsor, work the steps. Something changed. And every single one of these promises has materialized in my life, some more consistently than others, but they're all there. Promise 2 says, I'm no longer controlled by my fears. I overcome my fears and act with courage, integrity, and dignity. Promise 2 is built on the assumption that some of us may have resisted as newcomers that codependence is an illness built on fear. As we progress in our recovery, we learn how true that assumption is. We learn that in the midst of our illness, we are always afraid of someone or for someone. We learn that fear is the bedrock on which our codependent patterns are based. In step 4, we examine our fears. We might find that we're afraid of criticism or other people's anger. Maybe we're afraid of ridicule. We may be afraid of excessive attention or, ironically, of being ignored. Ultimately, we may realize that all of these stem from 2 core fears: rejection and abandonment. We're afraid that others won't accept us, or that having appeared to accept us, they will now reject us. We also realize that these fears are founded on a lack of self-esteem. We don't consider ourselves worthy, so we naturally conclude that others see us the same way. In the process of working the steps, we face our fears and we ask a loving higher power to release us from them. We gain self-esteem by performing esteem-worthy acts. The traditions guide us in dealing with others from a place of equality and self-respect. As we practice these new behaviors, we notice that less and less of our actions are being driven by our fears. At first, these new behaviors may feel wrong. We may even feel fake. I'm not courageous or dignified, we may think. I have no integrity. But our sponsors guide us in applying the recovery tool of acting as if. We act as if when we do the things that a courageous person would do, even if it terrifies us. We act as if when we do the things a person of integrity and dignity would do. And we practice these as we practice these new behaviors, as our fears loosen their grip on us, acts of courage, integrity, and dignity begin to feel more natural to us. In Promise 2, that I'm no longer controlled by my fears. What fears are we talking about? I don't know about you, but for me, every time I look at any of the fears that drive my codependent behavior, if I look underneath that fear, say, okay, what's wrong with a fear of public speaking? And I tunnel down. Well, the problem with public speaking is that I'm performing a task in front of a large group of people. And the problem with that is that I may fail. I may not do it well. They may judge me. And if they judge me, they may find me wanting. And if they find me wanting, they may reject me. They may throw me away. And it always comes back to that fear of rejection or abandonment. In Promise 2, it talks about courage. And what does courage look like? Well, in my reading, it turns out that courage is not the lack of fear. Courage is having fear and taking the indicated action despite the fear. Courage is what lets me overcome my fear, even when I'm feeling it. How do we define integrity? I like to think of that as program honesty. And we have cash register honesty and we have program honesty. I was always cash register honest, but I never had integrity because my go-to move as a codependent was to tell you what I thought you wanted to hear. There's no integrity in that. Program honesty says that my words and my thoughts and my actions all agree with each other. How can we display dignity in our lives that we talk about in Promise 2? The simplest way that I can think of is by setting boundaries for the first time. Dignified people have boundaries. Undignified people have either no boundaries or they have walls. Right? And so we learn how to set appropriate boundaries and maintain them, recognizing that every boundary that I ever set is not with somebody else, it's with myself. The boundaries are for me. Promise 3, I know a new freedom. What exactly does a new freedom mean to us? And freedom from what? For some, it's freedom from the fears we described in our 4th step. For others, it's freedom from expectations by ourselves or others. It might be freedom from the control of someone else's personality or from our own compulsions. For some of us, it's the freedom to finally be ourselves. Prior to recovery, many codependents describe the grip of their codependent patterns by saying, I had no choice. The program tells us that we always have choices. Our sponsor helps us to see those choices, and our higher power supports us in them. Once we've accepted life on life's terms and we've worked through the things that have been blocking us from our higher power, our choices expand. We begin to see the hand of a higher power in our lives, and we find the freedom to act on the will of that higher power rather than being trapped in our old ways. Promise 3 says that we'll know a new freedom. Freedom from what? For me, it was freedom from fear, freedom from my ego, freedom from the bondage of self. There's a very popular prayer in one of the other fellowships that talks about finding freedom from the bondage of self. And I needed freedom from the bondage of Ritchard. What would freedom look like to you? Just think about that for a second. What's something that you have done or could do to express that new freedom? Have you noticed that in your own recovery? Those things that we can do that were beyond us before. And what patterns of codependence are disarmed when we find that freedom? Promise 4. I release myself from worry, guilt, and regret about my past and present. I'm aware enough not to repeat it. Some codependents arrive in Codependence Anonymous mired in worry, guilt, and regret, paralyzed by shame. The CoDA literature helps us to understand the dynamics of the shame we've carried. Then our sponsor and our CoDA friends help us to see our lives from a different perspective. We learn the difference between acceptance and resignation. We accept that the events of the past actually happened and we don't have the ability to go back and change them. We accept today's situation as a reality rather than fighting it with the wishful thinking that we learn is called denial. Acceptance of the facts of our past and present finally allows us to explore our options and to take different actions. We apply ourselves to the program. In working the steps, particularly steps 4 through 9, we learn to see the difference between shame and our earned guilt. Reliance on a higher power rather than on others releases us from our shame, and we make amends to discharge ourselves of our earned guilt. Having accepted our mistakes and made amends to put things right where we could, we find that we no longer have to carry the burden of worry, guilt, and regret. We can walk the earth as free men and women without the constant fear of our past and codependent patterns. That idea that I can release myself from the regret about my past and present. I can release myself from the denial. For me, I grew up at the intersection of 3 different families affected by alcoholism. And one of the things that I had to accept in early recovery was that nobody in my life owed me a happy childhood. Because until I could accept that nobody in my life had a time machine that they could hop in and go back and fix my childhood, I couldn't get better. As long as I was attached to the idea that they owe me, that I was being the victim. And I learned here that victims don't recover, as long as I'm attached to my victimhood. But when I could accept that, okay, that happened, and where I go from here is my responsibility, that there's a lot of power in that. And that gave me access to the whole program. So, Promise 5. I knew a new love and acceptance of myself and others. I feel genuinely lovable, loving, and loved. For many of us, the core of our codependency is that we never felt lovable, loving, and loved. The desperate desire to feel loved, to belong, harmed our self-esteem and led us to compliant behaviors that further damaged our already low self-esteem. The fear of rejection and abandonment fueled our attempts to control others. Our fear of being hurt drove us to practice avoidance. In CoDA, we met fellow members who were committed to loving us until we could love ourselves. They modeled unconditional love for us and supported and applauded our efforts to behave in loving ways. One day, perhaps out of the blue, the thought may occur to us, these people and my higher power love me. Therefore, I must be lovable. The logic is irrefutable. Working the steps allows us to engage in estimable acts, and we slowly build self-esteem. Eventually, we may suddenly realize that we like ourselves, we respect ourselves, we even love ourselves. We realize that we love these people in our groups and others in our lives, and we learn new ways to express that love. We stop confusing love with approval or sex and find that once we love ourselves, we can be loving toward even the difficult people in our lives. You know, I cried in every meeting for the first 6 months. And the funny thing about that was that nobody ever criticized me. Nobody ever made fun of this 40-year-old guy who's crying like a little kid. They just loved me. And one day it came to me, I must be lovable. These people that I'm clinging to like a lifeline seem to love me. Another source there is sponsorship. I tell every new guy that I sponsor that after we've had a long talk about what sponsorship looks like, and I give them a chance to back out, I hit them with one final quasi-requirement. It's simply this. I love the guys that I sponsor, and I tell them that on a regular basis, and I don't care if that makes you uncomfortable. And we end that conversation with, I love you. And I end pretty much every conversation with a sponsee with, I love you. And what that does is, and what that did for me when my sponsor did it with me, was it drove home that dynamic of being lovable and loving and loved. Another area that's important, I think, in Promise 5 is that when I notice my self-talk changing, you know, it's a big part of my self-loathing. How I exercised that was by being really, really harsh with Ritchard. If he had the audacity to be imperfect, if he made a mistake of any sort, I would tell Ritchard what an idiot he was, what a moron he was, what a waste of skin he was. And I'm pleased to tell you that I don't do that anymore. I spent an entire year working just on my self-talk and on how I talk to Ritchard. And so today, if I make a mistake, it was, well, that was a mistake. Or my favorite is, well, that's suboptimal. let's do it different next time. And it's been a very long time since I was harsh with Ritchard. And the consequence of that is that I get up in the morning and I look in the mirror and I like the guy that I see there. But I've had to work at reminding myself that I like that guy in the mirror. Promise 6, I learned to see myself as equal to others. My new and renewed relationships are all with equal partners. Ladder thinking is a hallmark of the disease of codependence. Most of us saw the people around us as above us and to be obeyed, or beneath us, to be fixed or saved. In many of our relationships, we were dependent on the approval of others, and our relationships were automatically out of balance. Dependence on external approval meant that we would hand all of our power to anyone that asked for it, or seemed to ask for it, or might ask for it. Since nobody respects a doormat, our self-esteem plummeted. In our relationships, we may have seen the other person not as a person, but as a locus for problems we could solve. We reasoned that if they were such a mess, the noble thing to do, and we thought we were so very noble, was to step in and fix the problem for them. At first, they were often grateful, and we gained a temporary boost to our ego. But in solving their problems, we took control, or the illusion of control, of a swath of the other person's life. We had to. We were much more qualified to be in charge than they were. If and when the other person realized how we viewed them, they may have been hurt or offended. In CoDA, the 12 steps cultivate humility in us. Humility is not humiliation, but rather a proportionate and realistic view of ourselves with respect to others. We learn to identify, don't compare. The 12 traditions teach us that the only person responsible for solving another's problems is them. That's tradition 7. We learn to see where we stop and another person begins, and that's tradition 4. Most of all, we learn that we're all equal. It talks about that in tradition 2. Without the pressure to jockey for position on an imaginary ladder, we're free to be ourselves. We learn to relate to others exactly where they are, and they do the same for us. I was never all that interested in equality. I was like a dog in a dog pack. I wanted to know what the pack order was so that I could be in charge of the people underneath me and I could obey the people above me and fit in. What that really amounted to is that whenever possible, I wanted to be in complete charge or to have no control and have you in charge. So either I'm in complete control and I get to define how things are going to go, or you're in control and I get to blame you if things go badly. And that does not contribute, I want to tell you, to healthy and loving relationships. And so today, I do see the people around me as equals. And I work at maintaining that equilibrium to the best of my ability. And as part of my 10th step, I need to watch out for when I'm starting to feel superior, when I'm starting to feel like I'm in charge, or when I'm starting to feel subservient. And one of the most important tools that I've run across for that is that idea of identify, don't compare. Look for the similarities and not the differences. That applies out there in real life, not just here in our rooms. A message came up asking what I'm reading from. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the draft of a booklet on the promises that is a work in progress. Promise 7. I am capable of developing and maintaining healthy and loving relationships. The need to control and manipulate others will disappear as I learn to trust those who are trustworthy. Many of us discovered at an early age that trusting others often resulted in pain or disappointment. Growing up in a dysfunctional family system is inherently unstable and unpredictable. We learned that asking for what we want and need in a straightforward manner gave others the power to hurt us. In reaction, we learned to apply methods of control or manipulation to get our needs met. Over time, our patterns of control and manipulation inevitably drove others away. In CoDA, we were asked to consider the real source of the problem. Was it that other people are universally untrustworthy? Or were we perhaps surrounded by and attracted to people who were untrustworthy? Were we trusting too much, or were we simply trusting the wrong people? CoDA introduces us to relationships with sponsors and other recovery friends who are there for us, friends who go to great lengths to be there for us and to offer us safe and respectful environments. These are friends who are trying to live a life of honesty and authenticity. They're not perfect, but they try to say what they mean and do what they say. Slowly, perhaps, it dawns on us that we're not obligated to trust those who have proven themselves untrustworthy, but that there are at least a few trustworthy people in the world. Perhaps some of the trustworthy people were there in our lives all the time. We couldn't see them because we were so focused on the untrustworthy ones. But now we are free to offer at least a little bit of trust to someone that won't betray us. The little bit of trust that we've cultivated grows, and we're able to use it as the cornerstone for a new kind of relationship. We begin to experience relationships based on mutual trust and respect. We learn that the only healthy love, the only reliable love, is unconditional love. So we stop putting our trust in those who put a price tag on love. We become more trustworthy ourselves as we grow. We become more open and honest with the people that have been open and honest with us. We begin to enjoy real intimacy with others without exposing our vulnerabilities to those who don't deserve it. We begin to enjoy real, healthy, and loving relationships. How do we learn to trust? We talk about that a lot in the third step, where we look at turning our will and our lives over the care of a loving higher power. And it's a big step because we find it hard to trust. So how do we learn to trust? Well, by trusting a little bit and having that turn out well. And when that turns out well, that gives us just a tiny bit more confidence to trust a little bit more next time. And if that turns out well, and so on, and so on, and so on. And what happens is that as we learn to trust, we become more trustworthy, and trustworthiness earns respect. And that contributes to mutually respecting and loving relationships. And how do we relate to those who might not be trustworthy? Most of my life, I worked this promise backwards. I spent most of my life not trusting people who might have been trustworthy, and trusting people who were untrustworthy. And I did that for one simple reason. The untrustworthy people had this special skill, this special knack. They could get me to trust them instantly by saying one magic phrase. They would look me in the eye and they would say, "Don't you trust me?" Well, now I have to trust them, because if I don't trust them, they might be angry with me, and if they're angry with me, they might judge me. If they judge me, they might throw me away, and that whole chain gets activated. I've realized in CoDA that not once in my life do I recall anybody trustworthy ever asking me that question. So now, instead of being an instant mechanism to control me, it's a red flag. I've never had anybody trustworthy ask me that question and, in essence, demand my trust. So how do we spot trustworthy versus untrustworthy people? Our literature tells us to watch their feet, not their mouths. Watch their actions instead of their words. And as we learn to do that better, it starts becoming easier to spot the truly trustworthy and the truly untrustworthy people. And in the process, to become a little more confident in my own ability to discern that trustworthiness versus untrustworthiness. Promise 8 says that I learned that it is possible for me to mend, to become more loving, intimate, and supportive. I have the choice of communication with my family in a way which is safe for me and respectful of them. Codependence kills communication. Driven by self-centered fear, some of us have been constantly on our guard in communicating with others around us. In the past, when we've let our guard down, we've been misunderstood or misquoted or mischaracterized. We've been hurt. Often we've responded to the hurt by redoubling our guard and either walking on eggshells or shutting down. Eventually, the pressure of stuffing our feelings would build to the point that we could no longer control it, and it came out in an explosion of rage, completely out of proportion with the situation at hand. Some of us have tried to control communication by filling every silence, no matter how brief, with our own views. We were afraid to let others speak for fear of what they might say. We learned that we could keep ourselves safe, or we could be respectful of others, but we were unable to do both at the same time. In CoDA, we work the 12 steps in order to heal the wounds of our past. No longer in the clutches of that pain, we are free to take a new, more loving and supportive approach to those around us. Our sponsor, our CoDA friends, and the CoDA literature all offer suggestions in the form of their own experience, strength, and hope. If it worked for them, maybe it'll work for us. We apply some of these suggestions, and we develop new methods of communication based on the principles we learned in the 12 traditions. We begin to be able to risk intimacy, knowing that we can establish boundaries, and because there are boundaries, we can adjust them as necessary. It's an imperfect process of trial and error, but eventually we find that we've developed the capacity to communicate openly, honestly, and directly in a respectful way and without surrendering to abuse by others. What does it look like to be both safe and respectful at the same time? I'd boil that down to boundaries and courtesy. Again, we come back to boundaries. For me, the biggest place to learn to practice boundaries is by practicing the 12 traditions in my relationships, because every single one of those 12 traditions is about boundaries. On the respectful side, I would suggest that courtesy is an important value to cultivate. Courtesy is not the same as politeness. I can be really, really polite. Would you like another cup of coffee? Pass the salt, if you please. That's polite, but it's not terribly courteous. Courtesy is basically good manners combined with a genuine interest in the other person's well-being. And when I can cultivate that at the same time that I maintain boundaries, that looks to me like ways of communicating that are safe for me and respectful of the people around me. Promise 9, I acknowledge that I am a unique and precious creation. Low self-esteem is often the starting point for our codependence. Because we lack our own esteem, we seek esteem from others. As we chase the esteem of others and get ever more desperate for someone else's recognition or approval, we engage in codependent patterns that further damage our self-esteem. Often we find ourselves in a downward cycle of approval, seeking, there's supposed to be a hyphen here. We find ourselves in a downward cycle of approval seeking, driven by low self-esteem that is aggravated by our approval-seeking behaviors and motivated by more low self-esteem, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. Our CoDA friends show us a different path. It starts when the members of our CoDA group treat us as valued members of the group. They see value in us, so we begin to suspect that we may have value. There's an old saying in recovery circles, if you want self-esteem, perform esteemable acts. In CoDA, we work the 12 steps. We try to practice the 12 traditions in all our affairs. We make amends where we've caused harm. We engage in acts of service, not for any reward, but because it's the loving thing to do. At first, we may show up early to the meeting to set up chairs because we're trying to earn our place in the group. Eventually, we do it simply because we feel good about ourselves when we do. Nobody else needs to see or to be involved. Some of us prior to recovery felt odd or different. In CoDA, we begin to appreciate the value of being different. After all, the old timers tell us if any two of us were identical, one of us would be unnecessary. We find that the principles we are practicing in the 12 steps and 12 traditions allow us to channel our unique character into productive and useful paths, and we begin to embrace our uniqueness. Eventually, we realize that we are both unique and precious. Promise 9 is where I get to move away from that feeling of lonely, separate, different, afraid, to being unique and precious. These are just flip sides of the same coin. The lady that I'm married to likes to talk about how every defect of character that we have is really the flip side of a character asset taken to an extreme. Unique and precious. When I lose sight of how good that is, becomes lonely, separate, different, and afraid. And if I can get from the one to the other, it also means that I can get back. And that's what's happened for me in Promise 9. Promise 10, I no longer need to rely solely on others to provide my sense of worth. If I didn't have low self-esteem, I wouldn't have any, quips one CoDA member. In the past, we often had no self-worth. Our behavior was dictated by a need for someone else's approval, and we adopted patterns of behavior that were harmful to ourselves and others. We couldn't be honest about our thoughts and feelings with others. What if they were the wrong thoughts and feelings? We couldn't set boundaries. What if someone else didn't like our boundaries? We couldn't look after our own needs. Someone else's needs were always more important. Often we bankrupted ourselves emotionally and physically, if not financially, trying to buy someone else's approval and acceptance. In CoDA, we gradually build our self-esteem. Our progress through the 12 steps and our work in applying the 12 traditions contributes to a sense of self-worth that we may never have experienced before. We gain self-respect by practicing the principles of Tradition 4, autonomy, and Tradition 7, being self-supporting. We begin to realize that our opinion is just as important as someone else's opinion. That's Tradition 2. Ultimately, we grow to realize that our opinion about ourselves and that of our higher power are the only ones that really matter. We can separate ourselves from the need for someone else's approval. We know that we are worthwhile and important just as we are. Because of the nature of my codependency, my drug of choice being 5 minutes with someone else's approval, that drove some particular patterns of codependence. Codependents compromise their values and integrity in order to avoid rejection and other people's anger. Well, that's, again, predicated on the idea that I need that other person's approval so desperately that I'm willing to surrender my values, my integrity. And I know that it's wrong to lie or cheat or steal. But if that's what it takes to get that person's approval, I become a liar, a thief, and a cheat when I'm caught up in my illness. And I'll do it without thinking. I don't have to do that anymore because this promise has come true in my life. Promise 11, I trust the guidance I received from my higher power, and I come to believe in my own capabilities. If step 2 was a revelation for many of us, step 3 was a lifesaver. How long had we wandered through life rudderless and without direction? Lost, we latched onto others and made them our higher power. We became easy prey for abusers and manipulators. In step 2, we were introduced to a higher power of our own understanding. The only requirement on our own definition was that it be a loving higher power as specified in Tradition 2, and that it be greater than ourselves as defined in step 2. Many of us were amazed at the idea that such a power could exist and would be there to provide guidance and strength when we needed it. In step 3, we were asked to make a decision to follow the guidance of that power to the best of our ability. And suddenly our decisions were no longer determined solely by the self-interest of the imperfect people we obsessed over. We no longer turned our will and our lives over to the sickest person in the room. Instead, we tried to do the things that a wiser, kinder, more loving higher power wanted for our benefit. In time, our work through the rest of the steps helped us to become more consistent at hearing the guidance of our higher power and at following through on that guidance. Our decision-making and our choices became less frantic and more considered. We learned that my will is a constant urgency, God's will is a calm certainty, and we began to be able to tell the difference between the calm, quiet direction of our higher power and the strident demands of our codependence. As we became more consistent at pausing and consulting our higher power before taking action, we experienced more success. It became easier to trust our higher power, and our successes proved to us that we could walk through life with courage, integrity, and dignity. That relates back to something I was talking about earlier, that idea of how do we learn to trust? We learn by trusting a little bit and having that turn out well. And then we can trust a little more. And if that turns out well, we can trust a little more. And that especially applies to my relationship with my higher power. And after 17 years now, I still have days where I doubt that higher power. I still have lots of days where I doubt that higher power. But what I have today is a higher power with a track record. I have a higher power that I can look back and go, when I have consciously and completely turned an outcome or a decision or a situation over to that higher power, it has always turned out better than I was going to try to manipulate it. So maybe I can do it one more time. That is as close as I get to fully trusting the guidance I have from the higher power. Promise 12. I gradually experience serenity, strength, and spiritual growth in my daily life. It's been said that when we stop growing, we stagnate. Stagnation can be defined as dying very slowly. That's what many of us were doing before coming to Codependence Anonymous. When we honestly work the 12 steps and practice the 12 traditions, we change and grow. We can't help it. We don't even have to believe it'll work when we start. It just happens. Our newly found relationship with a higher power equips us with a new source of guidance and strength. Our daily practice of step 11 brings us into closer contact with that higher power and relieves us of our fears. We begin to see glimmers of that peace of mind we call serenity. We begin to be able to take risks and experience successes. Our work in the 4-step inventory helps us to see the reality of our lives more clearly. Our work in service to CoDA helps us to learn patience and tolerance. Our inventory work and amends in steps 8 and 9 help to free us from guilt and shame over our past actions. All of these things contribute to our feelings of serenity. Carrying the message of CoDA to others in step 12 is often described as our greatest opportunity for spiritual growth. As we work with newcomers and sponsor others in CoDA, we cement our own relationship with the steps and with our higher power, and we grow. It doesn't happen overnight for most of us. Looking back through these promises, we are sometimes surprised at how many of them have become true for us. At other times, we're excited by how much more growth is in store for us. As it says in the CoDA welcome, we have all learned to survive life, but in CoDA, we're learning to live life. Living is a process of growth. The 12 promises give us a measure that we can use to see that we are growing, that we're living. There's a writing in another fellowship that I'm really fond of. It talks about how sometimes slowly or haltingly, occasionally in great bursts of brilliance, those who work the steps change and grow. We see it first in those who walk beside us. And seeing that in others, we realize it's also possible for us. That's been my experience for the last 17 years. That sometimes slowly, usually slowly, but every once in a while, in great bursts of brilliance, I make progress. And sometimes I don't even notice until I realize, hey, that person isn't constantly being afraid of their mother anymore. Hey, neither am I. And that's the dynamic. I think that's why it's so important that there's more than one of us in these meetings, because I need the example that you set, and I hope I'm providing you with an example. So how do this serenity, strength, and spiritual growth manifest when we first begin to experience them? For me, it's the story of step 7. They show up in different behaviors. I don't know about your experience with step 7, but here's mine. I've engaged in the inventory steps. I've identified those things that are blocking me from a relationship with a loving higher power and getting in the way of me doing my higher power's will. And I've recognized the harm that those have done in my life, and I'm ready. So in step 7, I hit my knees and I ask a loving higher power to remove those things from me. And I pray a prayer that asks him to remove the things that get in the way of my usefulness to him and to my fellows. And I surrender my defects of character to my higher power. But nowhere in step 7 does it say that he's going to remove that stuff now. It's not an instantaneous thing. Instead, the way my higher power likes to work is that, okay, I'm a liar. So he's going to give me an opportunity to lie. And because I'm a liar, I'm going to lie. But now it really bothers me. I noticed myself doing that. And a day later, he's going to give me another opportunity to lie, but I'm still hurting from yesterday. And damn, I'm not going to lie this time, but I do because I'm a liar. And then the next day, another opportunity comes along, and I see this one coming. I'm not going to do it this time. I'm really not going to, but I'm a liar, so I lie. And then the day after that, another opportunity comes along, and this time I do something different. And that's my experience with the seventh step, is that over time, I am offered multiple opportunities to practice a defective character until I start doing it differently. And that is the essence of recovery for me, is that idea of doing something different. Because if it's not different, it can't be better. So what do serenity, strength, and spiritual growth look like? Me learning to do things differently, a little bit at a time. And it's cumulative. I do many, many things differently than I did when I was 12 years in recovery. And at 12 years, I had grown from 5 years. And at 5 years, I looked a lot different than I did walking in the door. And I just saw somebody comment that recovery is a process, not a destination. And I couldn't agree more. All I know is that I've been watching this trend line for 17 years, and I love where it's going. I want to find out where else it goes. So that was just a quick summary of those 12 promises. But now let's talk about how else we can think about them. Okay, well, when we look at the promises.
Excuse me, Richard. I just want to let you know that I know you started late, so we're extending 10 minutes.
Okay, so
you're almost at 2:45
that means
now.
We have 10 minutes from now.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, which means we're not going to have a lot of time for discussion.
Unfortunately.
I apologize. But we're getting
I know you started 20 minutes late, so you lost 10 minutes. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Most of us, when we first look at the promises, we look at them as something that's aspirational, right? Don't they look like, when we're new, they look like goals. It's like, holy cow, I'd love to get there. And we can use them as that simply by using the tool of acting as if. Right? By act as if I'm a man of courage, integrity, and dignity. And if I do that enough days in a row, it starts to settle in. But there's other things that we can use them for. Milestones. That feeling of accomplishment when I noticed for the first time that I was able to avoid an argument and to communicate with somebody in my family in a way which was safe for me and respectful of them at the same time. We can also use them as prayers. Higher power, help me to feel your guidance, or to hear your guidance. Help me to trust your guidance and come to believe in my own capabilities. We can use them as decision-making guides. Okay, here's my two options. What would somebody who's in an equal relationships do? What would somebody who's a man of courage, integrity, and dignity do in this situation? Or I'm unique and precious. I have value, even if this person is angry with me. That reminder that I'm not the man that I was. And I'm certainly not the little boy that they think that they're relating to. Or am I behaving like an equal partner in this situation? Part of my 10th step, looking over my shoulder, watching my behavior as I go through the day, and applying a set of guidelines. every single one of these promises can fit into that kind of dynamic. Or, I don't need this person's approval. I feel genuinely lovable, loving, and loved without them. In that tense moment, when the boss is being stern with me, maybe that's the thing that I can latch onto that lets me walk out of there without doing something that I'm going to regret later. So those are some of the ways that I think a lot of us end up using the promises. But what happens if we go a little bit deeper? How else can we use these? What happens if we internalize them? I want to point out something that you may have noticed is that when I read these promises, I don't read them the way that most people do in a meeting. That monotone. I'm no longer controlled by my fears. I overcome my fears and act with courage, integrity, and dignity. I try to read them with feeling, like I mean them, like they mean something to me. I'm no longer controlled by my fears. I overcome my fears and act with courage, integrity, and dignity. When I apply the promises in this way, when I invest feeling and meaning into them, I get to internalize them and I get to carry them around. I've been at this for quite a few years now, and if you give me the first two words of any of these promises, I can finish it for you off the top of my head because I've heard them that many times. But what I've found is that gives me the ability to bring them to mind as a tool when I need them. I've heard it said that a tool isn't useful if it's not within reach. And so this idea of reading them with feeling improves their ability to mean something to us, to be meaningful in our lives. And then once we've internalized them, we can start doing things like combining them. So, for example, promise, and you take any two of these promises and you combine them, you end up with an even more powerful statement is what I would like to offer to you. If I take promise 2 and promise 5, because I'm no longer controlled by my fears, I'm free to love and accept myself and others. Isn't that cool? How about if we take promise 3 and promise 10? I know a new freedom since I don't have to rely on anyone else for my sense of worth. Promise 4 and promise 2. I'm free from my worry, guilt, and regret about the past, so I can act with courage, integrity, and dignity today. Once we've internalized these promises, once they mean something concrete to us, they become useful in all sorts of ways. This is a big chunk of what I've been working on in my recovery in the last year or so. And what I've found for me is that the more of this that I pay attention to, the more I do experience serenity, strength, and spiritual growth in my daily life. 2020 has been a tough year. I don't know if anybody noticed. And I want to report to you that at no time during this year have I felt myself losing my grip. Have I felt myself getting off center because of something as inconvenient as a global pandemic? Yeah, it has been inconvenient, and I've had to develop ways of working around it. But I've been able to practice an acceptance that was not available to the Ritchard who walked in the door 17 years ago. And what I find is that when I remember to use these promises as tools, when I pay attention to how true they are in my life, it makes it easier to not lose my serenity. So That's about all that I have to tell you today. And I would love to have like 20 minutes to talk about this right now. First time I did this workshop, it was actually a 2.5 hour time frame. So we were able to pause for conversation as we went along. So this was a new experience for me. But at this point, if anybody has any comments or questions, I would be delighted to entertain those. You see a couple of hands up. I don't know if they're up from something else or these were people who were really prompt. So Karen?
You need help with the hand raising, or are you good?
I'm good. Assuming that Karen had her hand up to talk. Or it may be that Karen and Tracy were left over from something else and we're going to
I think they were left over.
Okay.
Yeah, Tracy
so
and Karen.
Maybe we'll lower those. I do need some help in lowering the hands.
Okay.
So Ksenia, your hand up went up. I saw it.
Hi. Lovely to see you again. I wanted
Pleasure.
to share about experience I had with use of promises. Actually, it was in another CoDA convention some years ago, and it was a workshop on affirmations where a woman presenting the workshop used promises as part of affirmations. And I didn't cry for the first 6 months in the meeting. It took me over 3.5 years to start crying in the meeting. So I'm jealous as hell. But I was like, the stuff, dude, I'm not feeling it. And we did a round of affirmations where we pulled out papers that I folded and I read it to the group I'm sitting with. I am, unique and precious creation and so on. And then on the second round, we were reading it to each other. And the woman pulled out a paper from me and said, "You are loving, lovable, and loved." And I was freaking snot sobbing. I asked her to read it back to me 5 times, and I really had a moment, and it very much hit home. So that was a very special use of promises for me.
Well, thanks, Ksenia. That would bring us to Austin.
Hey, Richard. Just wanted to say thank you so much for such an insightful lead. That was, I was going to say, I was originally planning on going to the 2B meeting and ended up here instead. And I'm really glad I ended up here because I think this is exactly what I needed to hear, actually. And that might be a bit of trust in my higher power and letting go of control because I think this was brilliant. I just want to say thank you for the reinterpretation of the promises. I really love how you phrase that and how you've changed the way I look at that in my mind. And yeah, that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Austin. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Richard, I made you co-host. You should be able to.
Yeah, you made my iPad a co-host. My computer would be more useful.
Oh, I see. I didn't realize there was 2 things. Okay.
So Amardeep, I'm probably not pronouncing that right. And
Hi,
after Amardeep, we'll go to Emily, who put a note in the chat, but she wasn't sure how to change her.
I'm going to give you an extra 5 minutes till 3:00 because you were really started late and there's a lot of hands up.
Okay. Thanks, Lawrence. Amardeep?
Okay. Hi, this is Amardeep, codependent. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was amazing. I enjoyed every minute of it. And I loved the way you went into detail about the promises. I can relate a lot more now to each of the promises. And I also loved how you mentioned about internalizing them because, yes, I do the same things. When I read the steps or whatever, I use that monotone voice. So now when the next time I'll do it, I know I'll do it with feeling and, understand it a lot more. And I also love the way you combined promises together. That was great. So thank you.
Well, and as you kind of alluded to, I would be remiss not to point out that same investing with meaning means a lot more if we do it with the steps and the traditions as well. So you're exactly right there. Emily wasn't sure how to raise her hand, so let's hear what she has for a question.
Yes, hi, I'm Emily, recovering codependent. Thank you so much for that, Richard. That was really powerful. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to, like, in the beginning of your journey with Codependence Anonymous, if you had ever had sort of the experience of very suddenly experiencing some of these promises and that carrying you for a while, and then all of a sudden you feel like you're back in your old patterns and you can't get out, and how to overcome that doubt that kind of creeps in.
A big chunk of that